Hello, welcome back to my world of stuff. My name, Paul Mount. You know, I've often opined, both here on this channel and in print, that the glory days of British television for kids, the 1960s and 1970s, when both BBC and particularly ITV created lots of really memorable and imaginative adventure, science fiction shows for kids. Kids today, TV is ghettoised a little bit. Kids today, of course, spend all their time on TikTok and Instagram and all these other strange places like YouTube, for example. They don't really watch much broadcast terrestrial TV. And that's a shame, because certainly my imagination, and one of the reasons I'm here doing things like this now, is because of the huge range of TV shows I watched when I was a kid on broadcast TV. Really exciting shows that were low budget, but were full of wit and imagination and colour. And perhaps surprisingly, a lot of those shows came from ITV, the commercial network in the UK. Many of those shows are the stuff of TV legend to certainly people of my generation. We're talking Time Slip, The Tomorrow People, Freewheelers. Great shows that really fired up the imagination and were, intentionally or not, rivals in my affections to Doctor Who, which was the mainstay, although never a children's series. It had that cross-generational appeal. And I felt that ITV were always chasing that sort of demographic, although that word wasn't particularly used at the time. They always wanted that sort of show, but they were hidebound by the fact that their shows of that nature ended up at tea time slots during the week. So those shows are all very fondly remembered, and they all have their fan clubs and their fan movements, and they have events to celebrate them. But one show in particular, which I absolutely loved at the time and only ran for 3 series, has sort of disappeared into the mists of time and is sort of forgotten. Till you remind people of it, I'm talking about the adventures of Taro, the Ace of Wands. Yes, Ace of Wands is a show which isn't that well remembered because of the circumstances of its making and the circumstances of its downfall in a way, and the fact it isn't readily available for people to view today in full. The series came about in 1970. It was created by Trevor Preston. Trevor Preston is a name who is well known and associated with later TV shows, grittier sort of crime shows like Fox and Out and Minder and The Sweeney. He worked on all those shows. But in the 70s, he was sort of not exactly a new writer. He'd done a BBC adaptation of C.S. Lewis's Narnia stories. But he had long since realised that kids were fascinated by adult dramas, particularly sort of gritty crime sort of dramas, although they weren't supposed to be watching it. And he thought it might be an interesting idea to create that sort of show for a younger audience. He created the idea of a series that would eventually be called Ace of Wands, and he approached Thames TV, who at the time were looking to increase their output of television drama for kids, and the show attracted the interest of Lewis Rudd, who was the controller of children's television at Thames, and he passed the show on to producer Pamela Lonsdale, who had worked with Trevor Preston previously on the Narnia show. And together they set about working out the format of the show and what it would be and how it would be presented. Preston developed the character who eventually became known as Taro. He was attracted to the name because of the fascination for tarot cards in the 1970s, and there's something mysterious and timeless about the word and the name Taro. And he envisioned a hero who wasn't a superhero. He specifically described as not being like Batman, but he was a hero who had some powers and he was mysterious, and we didn't know much about where he came from. That leads us to make, I suppose, the inevitable comparisons with Doctor Who in the basic format of Ace of Wands. You had a mysterious hero character. We don't know much about him. We don't know much about his history. And the context of his adventures, he has 2 companions who don't exactly travel with him because it's all based in London, but he has companions who help him in his investigations. Casting for the series was, of course, extremely important. You needed somebody young, trendy, charismatic, and the show settled upon a Scottish actor who was just making a name for himself in television by the name of Michael Mackenzie. He took on the role of Taro, suave, debonair, sophisticated, very much part of that late 60s, early 70s London set. He was given 2 assistants, first of whom was Lillian Lully Palmer, who we met in the first episode when she reversed her sports car into his car. She was played by Judy Lowe, who at the time was married to the much-missed comedian and actor Richard Beckinsale. She shared a telepathic link with Taro. Also on board was Sam Maxted. He was the muscle, he was the heavy played by the brilliant character actor Tony Selby, known through a multitude of roles on TV over the years, until his sad passing a few years ago. He was very much the male sidekick who did the heavy lifting, if you like. He did the physical stuff that really wasn't appropriate for Taro. There were other characters, however, that sort of orbited around Taro. He had a Malay fish owl called Ozymandias, who would often perch on his shoulder, observing events, and an antiquarian bookshop owner, Mr. Sweet, played by Donald Lane Smith. The suggestion was he knew a little bit more about Taro's background, but didn't tell anybody about his background. But he often led the way into the stories, because I think they were quite keen that there should be no sort of police or detective involvement. Stories should come to Taro organically. Series entered production, 13 episodes in May 1970 and debuted in July 1970. It was actually still in production when the show actually began airing, which is something which happened quite a lot. Certainly in the 60s, Doctor Who was very often halfway through a serial on TV and they were finishing off the last few episodes. That was how TV was made in those days. Churned out, videotaped, cheap, low budget, easy to make and easy to get on screen. Ace of Wands was certainly very low budget. The show was restricted to 1 or 2 sets, including Taro's pad, which was this sophisticated London apartment, and a couple of other studio sets. The cast were to be only the main cast and a few other extra cast members, and location filming was to be restricted to a couple of minutes per episode if necessary. Low budget children's TV, not an enormous priority, but an audience that commercial television wanted. The series started off and was a huge success. The scripts were written across the run by names like Trevor Preston himself. Other scripts written by P.J. Hammond, who went on to create Sapphire and Steel. He's often said that Ace of Wands was influential really in the creation of Sapphire and Steel. Victor Pemberton, who had written for Doctor Who and written for Timeslip a few years before. Don Houghton, who was at the time writing for Doctor Who. My favourite serial, Inferno, was written by Don Houghton. He would also go on to write some Hammer Dracula films in the next couple of years. So there's a good pedigree of talent working on this show. And across the first season, we can see the run of extraordinary adventures that Taro, Luli and Sam got themselves involved with. The story sort of edged on comic strip with sort of villains like Madam Midnight in the first story, 1 and 1 and 1 of 4, played by Hildegard Neal. In the second episode, you had Senor Zandor, played by Vernon Dobtruff. The third story had a sort of a Nazi bent to it, with Christopher Benjamin played the villainous Falk. And the fourth and final story of the last series was The Smile, in which a villainous art thief, Tunju, played by Willoughby Goddard, planning to steal the Mona Lisa. These were very much comic strip, colourful, actiony adventures, fast-paced, enticing, and of course with the lure of these fabulous lead 3 characters. Unsurprisingly, Ace of Wands was a big hit. Ratings started off at 2 million, but by the end of the season they climbed to 4 million, so unsurprisingly, second series was commissioned. That went into production the following year, had finished production by the time it aired in July 1971. Again, another 13 episodes. Series started off with Trevor Preston's extremely memorable Seven Serpents, Sulphur and Salt, which introduced Russell Hunter as Mr. Stabs, an evil magician who planned to steal a missing segment of the secret 7 serpents from Taro. We also had stories like Joker, which was quite edgy, I suppose, in that it showed children being driven insane by a fiendish character called Uncle Harry, played by Dermot Toohey. And the series ended with the Eye of Ra, in which the mysterious Cerebron sets out to steal a huge diamond called the Eye of Ra, which it's claimed will turn people into chalk. Taro traces him and is made prisoner of a talking computer who plans to use giant chess pieces to crush him to death. Richly imaginative stuff, really exciting, and again, ratings were rising. The show was just building and building and building. But things were changing for the planned third series. Pamela Lonsdale, the producer, had moved on to other projects, and John Russell, who directed many of the previous 2 seasons' episodes, was brought in as the new producer, and there was a slight change to the flavour of the show, which was brought about because, sadly, Trevor Preston himself had not exactly lost interest in the show, but he was also moving on to other adult projects now, and Ace of Wands was sort of in the rear-view mirror as far as he was concerned. And also, there was to be a change in front of the camera. Taro was still on board, Michael Mackenzie was still on the show, but Judy Lowe felt that the character of Luli was a bit of a cipher. She was a bit of a screamer. She kept getting into trouble, getting captured and needed rescuing, and she didn't feel there was any real development to the character, despite that sort of psychic bond between her and Taro. Also out was Tony Selby as Sam. He had a theatre engagement which he couldn't resist and couldn't turn down, which clashed with the filming dates for the third series. So Luli and Sam were written out of the show. 2 new characters were brought in for the slightly different third series, which had a slightly different air to it. It was less comic strippy, more grounded, but still with a very fantastical feel to the stories. The new characters were brother and sister Mickey and Chaz Diamond. Mickey was played by Petra Markham, Chaz was played by Roy Holder. He'd appeared in the previous series in the serial called Joker. He was a photographer, she was a journalist, she too shared a psychic link with Taro. They lived in a fairly upmarket looking 2-level apartment somewhere in London's Wapping East End, and Taro now had moved to a houseboat, so the look of the series had changed, the dynamic had changed, it was sort of moving in an organic way. But the adventures continued. Mr. Sweet was less of a presence now, he only appeared occasionally, he was now a university librarian. Although the stories remained fantastical, they were a bit more grounded, as we see in the first story, The Meddlers, a 3-part story, which is interesting to watch because there's quite a bit of location in this. And Chaz and Mickey live in this flat overlooking the street market, which is under a curse. It's also due to be demolished. And we see lots of interesting, fascinating location footage of London in the early 70s, when the East End still had that sort of bohemian feel to it, with bands walking through the streets, people playing spoons, and it has that sort of post-war sort of feel to it. The show also ostensibly went to Egypt in The Power of Atep, written by Victor Pemberton, although it was famously not filmed in Egypt. I think it was filmed in a sandpit near London with a few strategically placed palm trees to make the audience think they were in Egypt. And we also had two of the most remembered stories, in fact, Peacock Pie's extremely memorable 3-part story, which stars Brian Wilde as a man who has the power of suggestion and he can make people bend to his will. It's quite a sinister, creepy sort of story, and the interesting thing about it is that Mr. Peacock walks free at the end of the story. There's no sort of justice. He's not necessarily an evil man, he's just a man who has this power and uses it without quite realising the consequences of it. Mama Doc is quite a bizarre story set on a doll's hospital where people are being turned into dolls. Sisters Deadly is a very unusual 3-parter about some extremely elderly sisters who have a plan to reinvigorate the British Empire. And the season ended with The Beautiful People. It's an interesting story that seemed to take the show into new directions. A 4-part story featuring 2 beautiful girls whose involvement with Taro leads into an investigation into what appears to be extraterrestrials with strange powers. The serial, and in fact the series, ends with a massive explosion which suggests that Taro, Mickey and Chaz have been killed. That was to be resolved in a 4th season, but that 4th season never happened. Ace of Wands disappeared at the end of its 3rd season, with ratings now just over 6 million. This was a show that was really building in popularity and was heading towards a peak, but it did not come back. The reasons for this are largely because Thames TV were moving on with a new series, The Tomorrow People, created by Roger Price, which would adapt the similar sort of format of 13-episode seasons for a few years, telling the story of the next stage of human evolution. But that's another video. So Ace of Wands disappeared towards the end of 1972 after a 20-episode run, only to return the following year with a short run of repeats. The tragedy of Ace of Wands really is people don't really remember it because it's never been repeated since 1974. There was no spin-off merchandise, there were no books, there were no annuals, there were no comic strips. All that existed in terms of merchandise for Ace of Wands were a couple of articles in magazines like Look In and the TV Times. There was nothing. The show was not commercialised or exploited in any way, which is a shame because it means it's just drifted out of people's memories and been forgotten. And the fact that its first 2 seasons don't exist, they were wiped from the archives years ago. So all that exists in full, luckily, we have the entire 20-part 3rd season that was released on DVD by Network a few years ago. It's still available, you can still find it. It's supported by a very interesting behind-the-scenes booklet and a very interesting documentary, which I think is now on YouTube, which you can watch there. And of course, some episodes of the show are also on YouTube. One of the most memorable features of the series, and something that people who do remember the show recall, is not only the slightly spooky title sequence, but also the very trendy theme tune by Angie Bown called Taro. This was released as a single, in fact, and the BBC played it without realising it was the theme tune to an upcoming ITV series. And the song was actually gaining a bit of traction in terms of airplay. They dumped it and it wasn't a hit, but it's a really catchy tune. I can't play it here because of stupid copyright reasons, but I'll put a link in the description below to YouTube where you can find the track, the theme to Ace of Wands, which many people who heard it at the time, and I'm one of them, heard the lyrics as Taro Banana Man, but he's in fact the Diamond Man because he's the Ace of Wands. Check out the video. Ace of Wands then is a show which I remember very, very fondly. I would absolutely love to see those first 2 seasons, but sadly it ain't gonna happen. But it is a show which I think deserves to be remembered. That's one of the reasons I wanted to do this video, because I have fond memories of the show, and I did watch the third series when it came out a few years ago, and it just made me want to see those earlier, slightly weirder seasons again. But it's a great show, and it just typifies that particular era of television when kids weren't talked down to. Because if you watch Ace of Wands, it's a children's series, and there's no overt blood or violence or nastiness, but it's full of very good ideas. And the scripts and the dialogue are naturalistic, and there's no patronising to the child audience. It assumes that the audience watching it has a decent level of intelligence and is able to follow sophisticated scripts. It's a great show, and I remember it very fondly, and I hope that this video has triggered a few memories for you out there. Incidentally, if you want to find out more about Ace of Wands, I would heartily suggest you run to your nearest WH Smith's or larger Tesco's, pick up a copy of the latest issue of Starburst magazine. It came out in December. It's available, should be on shelves to the end of February. There is an article in the magazine called Aces High. You'll see that I wrote it. I researched the series fairly heavily a few years ago. I conducted a Zoom interview with the star Michael Mackenzie, which will appear in the next issue of the magazine, which is out in March. I just felt it was a show that needed, a bit of love and a bit of attention. And on that point, the first ever Ace of Wands event is going to take place in March, the end of March 29th. So if you're interested in the show, if this video has piqued your interest in any way, then might I suggest you take a look at this. It's an Ace of Wands mini event being held at the Quad in Derby. I've been to the Quad before. I went there in 2017 for an event to celebrate Jerry and Sylvia Anderson's UFO. And it's a venue in the centre of Derby that does a lot of this sort of stuff, little events and conventions and so on. And they're doing a event on the 29th to celebrate Ace of Wands, which has never been celebrated in this way on stage before. Michael Mackenzie will be there, and there will be screenings of two of the stories. I think they're going to show The Meddlers and Peacock Pie are going to be shown there on the big screen, which will be fun. And of course there'll be a Q&A with Michael Mackenzie afterwards. So if you're interested in that, why not come along? And if you do come along, I'm hoping to be there. And if you see me, come up and say hi. Finally, in terms of Ace of Wands, a bit of a random shout out. As I mentioned, the first two series don't exist. There's not a lot of photographic material available. Scripts aren't available for a lot of stories. So this is just a completely random shout out to anybody out there who not necessarily remembers the show, but if anybody out there has a family member who may have old film cans or old material, photographs, scripts, this sort of stuff sometimes disappears into the wild and ends up in sheds and attics and so on. If anybody out there knows of any material related to Ace of Wands, it may ring a bell. You may suddenly think, I remember this show. My granddad used to talk about this, and he had some film cans or scripts. Please have a look. Please see if there's anything out there in your sheds or in garages or anywhere that might have been laying there for years that's fallen into your hands and you didn't know it was there. You'd forgotten it was there. You'd totally forgotten the show, which is entirely understandable. If you do find anything like that, please leave a message down below. Let me know, because I know there are Ace of Wands fans out there who would love, and I'm one of them, to see some of this stuff. So if by any 1,000,000 to 1 chance anybody out there has got anything related to Ace of Wands at all, please let me know. Leave a comment down below. Right, that's me done for this video. I hope I've done justice to this really good show. I really enjoyed this show. And I just wanted to give it a bit of loving, because it's just been forgotten over the years, and I understand why, but I think it's a show that people need to be reminded of, particularly people who might well have seen it at the time, and I think there's quite a few people in my audience who may well have seen the show and forgotten it. So I'm glad I hope I've reminded you of something from your childhood. Right, thank you for watching this video. If you've enjoyed it, please like and subscribe to the channel. We do a lot of retro stuff here, plus new stuff, a lot of Doctor Who videos, all sorts of things. So click that button to subscribe, leave a thumbs up, leave a comment down below. I will see you very soon. Until I do, keep taking the stuff.